Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. Today, I will be interviewing Baylen Linnekin. He is a leading food law and policy attorney. He's also an author and a scholar. He wrote Biting the Hands That Feed Us: How Fewer, Smarter Laws Would Make Our Food System More Sustainable, a book that exposes the countless ways that federal, state, and local food rules and laws hamper sustainability efforts. But to me, Baylen is, and always will be, Burning Grill Man, because when I was very little, he set our grill on fire while he was cooking for us, and I don't know, I just named him that, and it stuck. That said, he's an excellent cook, and welcome.
Thanks very much for having me on. I'd like to. I have fond memories of the grill incident as well, but pretty sure it was because maybe your mom had cooked duck breasts on the grill before, and so there was a lot of fat. In other words, while I appreciate the nickname and I'm happy to go by it, really it wasn't my fault.
Ah, yes. Yeah, I mean, my mom burned her eyebrows off twice on our grill cooking. Twice in like a year, so I don't know. That's her. So before we jump in, I wanted to ask you, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't know?
Yeah, so you sent me this question and another one that you will ask towards the end, and I thought about this probably a lot longer than I should have. Or, I mean, it's not an easy question, as you know. I don't have kids, and so that right there, sets me up for some challenges. But I guess, anyways, I thought about it a lot, and it doesn't really have anything to do with food or even law necessarily. But I think it's probably a timely message, which is that despite how things seem right now, things in this country have been far worse in the past. And so I like to think that things will get better. The present state of things will improve, whether or not it feels that way right now. And this is sort of the call to action part of things, they'll get better faster if we take responsibility and work together to get past what I think are some pretty entrenched and, in many cases, idiotic, ideological, and partisan divides.
Good response.
Right?
Okay, so why did you become a food lawyer, and what does that mean? Does it involve eating at all?
It does. Everything involves eating, ultimately, because without food, we're not at our best. Let's say. So I've been asked this question many times. I don't think I've ever answered it the same way twice. But I've always liked to eat and cook, as you noted. You kindly said I'm a good cook, which I appreciate. Maybe an exaggeration, but I'll take it. And so when I was in law school, there were a lot of cases that centered around food law. And I'd had a food policy blog for years before I went to law school even. But a lot of the cases that we discussed in law school were food cases, particularly in our constitutional law class. These sort of really important cases that have been decided throughout history, and they're food cases, and no one was arguing in those cases that they had any sort of rights as pertains to food. Like, no one said, I have a right to grow this wheat because I'm a farmer and the government doesn't have any power or authority to infringe upon my rights of growing wheat. And I mean, that right there is a seminal U.S. Supreme Court case, and from something like 75, 80 years ago, called Wickard v. Filburn. But no one, Roscoe Filburn, who was, I think, an Ohio farmer, wasn't arguing that he had a fundamental right to grow wheat. He was just arguing that the USDA program, was unconstitutional for a variety of sort of other non-rights related reasons. And it occurred to me, no one had ever really made this sort of argument. Do we have rights as pertain to food, and if so, yeah, where do they come from? It's one thing to understand that you have rights. It's an entirely different thing to be able to discuss, where those rights spring from, how long have we had those rights, what protections do those rights have, if any. So that was, I guess, around that time, which was my first year in law school. I think at that point I decided that food law was something I was going to focus on.
Does your work involve fighting mostly for individuals who want to eat whatever they want without the interference of government? For instance, people who want to drink raw milk or people who like to forage for food in nature?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it more for people who want to produce their own alcohol? Or is it for restaurants or food trucks or other, I don't know, others in the food industry?
Yes, all of those things. The concept of food freedom. I didn't invent the term, but I have offered a definition of it, which I think is a pretty good one. Which is food freedom means that everyone has a right to grow, raise, produce, buy, sell, share, cook, eat, and drink the foods of their own choosing. And unfortunately, you're a minor, so those rights don't necessarily apply to you. Um, but everyone over the age of 18 has that right or those rights, and those are individual rights. But also, if five people want to band together and start a food truck, their rights are not diminished because they're working together. They're the exact same rights. So it's individuals all the way up to big corporations. Whether people like those corporations or not, have rights to produce food and to provide it to us, and we have a right to buy it and to make our own. And I'm pretty firmly in the camp that that this is um, not something that can be infringed upon without good reason by the government.
Which makes sense. So let's talk about laws that kill innovation around like food. So what are the different agencies that impose regulations on food, and what are the different rationales for those regulations?
Um, well, I mean, at the federal level, you have the FDA regulates the Food and Drug Administration regulates approximately 80% of the food supply, and those things it regulates includes pretty much all packaged food that you get at the store. Your Oreos or your uh, bag of popcorn, anything with a nutrition facts panel, an FDA nutrition facts panel on it. And they also regulate basically everything that the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, does not regulate. And the USDA focuses chiefly on meats and poultry, catfish, which is an interesting recent addition. And then it has some other areas. Certainly, like there's overlap around organic food. Both the USDA and the FDA can regulate that food. Um, and eggs, the FDA regulates eggs that are in the shell. The USDA regulates eggs such as you would find in one of those little cartons, of liquid egg mix. The USDA regulates frozen pepperoni pizza, whereas the FDA regulates frozen cheese pizza. These are all the fun things you learn about in food law classes in law school. And so those are the key federal agencies, and certainly the Environmental Protection Agency and other agencies. The Federal Trade Commission regulates marketing of food, along with marketing of everything else. So it's heavily regulated at the federal level. States also have state health departments that regulate restaurants, for example, and or that delegate to counties or city governments that power. So food's very highly regulated. It's one of the more highly regulated things that we buy and sell in this country. And the justification for federal regulation and then probably on down to local has always been around adulteration and misbranding. Adulteration means basically putting something in a food that's not supposed to be there. And typically that involves some sort of covert action. You're adding sawdust to your flour to try and maximize your yield and profit and all that, but you're not telling consumers that you're putting sawdust. This was the sort of thing that happened in the early 1900s, and which spurred a whole lot of federal regulations. So that's the adulteration, and then the misbranding is around the labeling portion of things. You claim that you're marketing 100% agave tequila, but inside the bottle actually would be, something Coca-Cola. That's not the right thing. So those are the two sort of fundamental ways that federal, state, and local governments regulate food, and they do it through inspection, which is the way to kind of enforce the adulteration and misbranding provisions of federal law, of state law, and of local food law.
So if you could like change rules or get rid of rules, if there were like a top 5, if you were in charge for one day and on the federal, state, and local level, you could just get rid of them, which ones would you get rid of and why?
That's tough. I would say I would farm subsidies, which are a program that's part of a program that's carried out by the USDA and that pays farmers, basically cash for insurance these days. This is the way that farm subsidies operate. It's the taxpayers subsidizing the insurance paid by farmers. It's a terrible idea. It's always been a terrible idea. I'd get rid of that probably first. There's a bit of a crisis these days, as you may have heard, around meat and supply problems, because many of the larger processing plants have employees who are sick with COVID-19, and there have been inspectors, USDA inspectors, who've also been sick. And a lot of that is just a function of these large facilities where people have to work really fast and really close together, and it's not conducive to slowing down or to taking steps to protect oneself health-wise. I think they had even outlawed masks up until recently, because of I don't know, just perceived problems that could arise from people wearing masks. Or, of course, a lot of these workers, some of these workers, I should say, and even some USDA inspectors have died because of COVID-19. So I would pass, there are 2 laws right now that I think are really important that Congress is considering. One is the Prime Act, which would allow smaller, what are known as custom meat processing plants and animals that had passed through there to be sold within the state to restaurants, grocers, co-ops, things like that, at farmers markets. And there's another one called the New Markets Act, which I'm abbreviating the much longer title. And that would allow state-inspected meat to be sold across state lines. Right now, about half of the states inspect their meat that's processed within their borders in a way that the federal government approves of, and yet the federal government doesn't allow those cuts of meat to be sold across state lines. So that would be another rule. Bans on sharing food with the homeless is another terrible rule that exists in many cities throughout this country, and it's despicable, and I would get rid of all those bans right now in a heartbeat. I think that particularly these days when we frankly need more charitable outreach, I think that rule is in cities, I think Philadelphia, Las Vegas, Houston, Dallas, Fort Lauderdale, lots of cities around the country, New York City have had these rules in place. So that's 3 particularly awful rules right off the bat. I would repeal the Food Safety Modernization Act, which at least the portions that govern farms in this country and small food processors. I think that those rules don't make any sense, and even the FDA admits that they cost hundreds of millions of dollars, but they're not likely to make food safer. And I've written about that a bunch. If you want some article citations, I'd be happy to share. So that's
Yeah.
what, four rules. Let me see what else we got. Talked about. Well, I'm sorry. I should, because I'm adamantly opposed to the foie gras ban in California, and now New York City has a similar ban in place. I would immediately lift all foie gras bans. You're familiar with foie gras, I would assume.
Yeah. Wait, so what's the reasoning for that ban?
The premise is that it is, and this is not me arguing it, but I'm arguing on behalf of animal rights and animal welfare people, is that the process of gavage, which is force feeding of a duck or um, of a goose. Thank you. The other thing I was trying to think of. In order to swell its liver up to several times its natural size, and that foie gras means fatty liver, as you may know.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you're left with is this fatty liver, and you can use the rest of the bird just as you would. You can get fat from it. You can get feathers for pillows, all these sorts of other things. But this ban was put in place at least, I guess, 10 years ago in California, although it didn't take effect until around 2012. And there's been a long court battle over the law, the ban. And I would urge animal welfare advocates, if they don't want to eat foie gras, not to eat it. But there are plenty of people around the country and around the world who've been eating it. Cultures have been eating it for thousands of years. And I don't believe it's an inhumane practice. I think that anything can be done humanely or inhumanely. And I think it really comes down to the producer. And so, let's when instances of animal abuse on farms, big or small, are happening, then I've always supported people's ability to expose that in order to, tell the truth about the people who are producing food. But that's a small percentage of food producers. So rescind the foie gras ban, but punish those bad actors who aren't following humane and or other food processing rules.
Which seems logical, right? I don't know. I would think the that's how I would think about it. It's like not hurt the people who are not doing anything wrong. I don't know. I don't know. But so you were talking about laws that
Let me interrupt just to go
oh
back.
yeah.
You're saying you don't know. You do know. I mean, I think your instinct is right. I think that we need laws. I'm happy that I'm a lawyer because I believe in the rule of law. But the question then becomes, which laws and why. And if what I'm doing isn't hurting you, um, and if you can avoid me and me doing that, then I think that's always the best way. Is there's a concept of the harm principle versus the precautionary principle, and the harm principle says, and I'm oversimplifying vastly, but I can't do something that harms you. I can do everything up until the point that it harms you. Whereas the precautionary principle says, let's exercise caution and make sure that if you're going to do anything, that we know that it won't harm you. Um, and so it's a different approach, but the harm principle, which is, I think a good basis for society, is let's let people do things that don't harm other people. And if they are doing that, or even doing terrible things to animals, then let's halt it if and when that happens. But otherwise, people should be free to make their own choices.
Yeah. So something you mentioned was rules about banning donations to homeless people.
Mm-hmm.
And you've given this example, not here, but in the past, you've given this example that's kind of funny, but it's kind of infuriating. because so it's Michael Bloomberg, when he was the mayor of New York City, he banned food donations to homeless shelters because city the city couldn't assess the salt and the fat and the ingredient contents of the food, and so they just banned it altogether. But it seems like eating food that's too salty or too fatty beats not eating at all, right? So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean that's exactly you've picked out a great example and kind of explained the problem with it. It's the perfect is the enemy of the good is one popular saying, which says that um, if there are homeless people, for example, and they're hungry, we you know we could feed them foie gras, but they might not like it, and they probably would prefer to um, eat foods that they're familiar with and which are going to keep them alive just as well as foie gras. Um, the premise that the government should have some sort of say in what people in need are eating is an increasingly popular one in this country, and it pertains to anything from the example that you just cited to arguments about people who are receiving SNAP benefits, which are formerly known as food stamps. Um, should the government have a say in what they're buying with that food? Um, and I don't think so. I mean, I think that a cash payment to people makes more sense than some sort of here's a list of things you can and can't buy based on what the government thinks you should eat. But as with the homeless feeding ban in New York City, these things, as you've noted in a response a minute or two ago, these things seem like common sense, but then when governments, with agendas get involved, suddenly you've got these other rules which really don't make sense.
Yeah. So you mentioned a little bit ago food labeling as something that is kind of an issue.
Mm-hmm.
So in 2014, in an effort to fight obesity, an FDA rule was finalized that required chain restaurants and like large scale vending machine operators to display the calories on menus and on menu boards. And they had to put like other nutritional information like calories from fat, cholesterol, sugars, proteins, stuff like that. And it had to be available in writing upon request. And I would think it should go without saying that, and I mean, you've said this also, that it is not really the role of the government to tell you what to eat. But if the government does have a right to interfere in people's nutritional choices and their choices surrounding food, do these rules work? Like rules requiring nutritional value to be written out? Does that help in fighting obesity? And if it works, is there a cost?
Yeah, great question. I mean, if these rules worked, then you would think that obesity would be going, down. The rates would be plummeting. Um, they're not, and so why is that? I mean, it's frankly, and I think I'm finding this out personally during the COVID-19 home isolation part of things. I'm not eating terribly healthy. Before this I was eating pretty well, and yeah, with this around, we have more limited options, and I've definitely found that my clothes are maybe a little tighter than they were, let's say, before this started. I think that the government has a role to play in requiring food manufacturers to provide some very, very limited information. And they've required this for hundreds of years in this country. And that's, the name of the food, uh, where it was made, the name of the company that made it, and, their address and how to reach them, ingredients. And, I don't have any problem with allergen labeling. I think that's useful for a significant percentage of people. But these are very different things, and or these are it's a narrow list of things, and the companies pay a lot of money to on labeling and producing labels that will catch our eye. Um, And when the government tries to take up more and more real estate on that food label, I mean, a can of soup has a finite amount of space on their food label to catch your eye and tell you what's unique or interesting about their product, try to compel you to buy it. Um, but government just keeps taking up more and more space on that, and it's not, any research that has been published on this subject. I should say virtually any. There's always some outlier. Um, Demonstrates that people don't read food labels for the most part. The people who do are people who are educated and probably watching their food intake anyways. That's a small percentage of people. The people who most need this information aren't using it. Um, and so the government pretending that simply adding more and more information to the label, more and more mandatory information to the label, is somehow going to end the obesity crisis is disingenuous. And I feel like unless the government acknowledges that, then really there's no way to force any maybe force isn't the right word, but to get people to change their eating habits.
Do you think there's a chance that the government will acknowledge that?
No.
Yeah, me neither. But one can hope. So, um, something that I also think about. I mean, you said that like some of this stuff has been required for a long time, but not nutritional information necessarily. But haven't restaurants and websites and companies been providing nutritional information for longer than it's been required?
Absolutely. I mean, there were times, and I alluded to this before, when someone would claim that they were selling 100% whole wheat flour, and there was some, uh, sawdust added to it or something like that. So we're not talking about that. I mean, that is and should be illegal. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, the nutrition facts panel only sprung up within the last something like 25 years. And it was supposed to be the sort of end all be all, but of course the government's always changing it. The Obama administration changed it, and there have been other tweaks to it as well. And if it's such a good idea, then I always wonder why they need to keep changing it, um, which makes it seem like maybe it wasn't such a good idea, or maybe it's not working. And I understand, we all do something and then tweak it, but a lot of this is it's silly because the government's dietary advice has for decades now um, been deeply flawed, and each new report by the government on its dietary advice, and this comes out every 5 years or so at the federal level, um, basically tells you why the last set of advice was wrong. You shouldn't eat fat. You should avoid fat. You should, sugar's okay, and carbs are fine. But then something comes out later. It's like, well, actually, fat's fine and good for us. But it turns out carbs are bad or whatever. I'm not a nutritionist, and I don't give nutritional advice. So I don't have any sort of skin in the game in that respect. But the government shouldn't be, and going all the way back at least to Thomas Jefferson, argued that the government shouldn't be giving us dietary advice, shouldn't be choosing which foods we eat, and that's certainly one of the more personal decisions that people get to make and have to make, and the government should have little, if any, role in deciding what we eat.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like you don't have to be a nutritionist to be able to tell that every time the government says something about nutrition that contradicts the thing that they said before, I feel like you can tell it's a little bit shaky. I don't know. Um,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
so there's this panel at AEI that I heard you debating on. It was about food and government against food trucks,
Mm-hmm.
foodies, farmers markets, stuff like that. And you talked about the chronicopia, which is cronyism in the food industry, or the unhealthy marriage between big government and big food companies, and kind of how that impacts smaller food industry businesses and stuff. And for my listeners, if you want to learn more about cronyism, listen to my episode with Matt Mitchell because that's where you can find all of that information. But specifically food, you talk about the different ways that big food companies and the big guys team up with the government to kind of put in place these barriers against small guys like small farmers or farmers markets and other companies, other groups. Can you talk to us about that? And can you also give us a few examples of rules that are put in place in the name of food safety but actually kill competition?
Sure. I can think of one really shining example that I highlight in my book, which is there's a federal rule which is currently being challenged, and many states have implemented, maybe even most states have implemented a sort of a copycat state rule, and that rule is around what is skim milk. Um, we all think of skim milk as that sort of slightly weird bluish, cloudy water kind of thing that some people drink. Um, and the question is not, is skim milk good or bad, which I have zero opinions on, but it is what is skim milk, which it's. I think most people would say something like it's milk with the fat removed. And there was a small creamery called O'Cheesy, which still exists in the Florida Panhandle area, and they were selling skim milk, and they were doing it for years. And they're very small. I think they have the husband and wife who own it. Maybe they have one more employee, or at least this was the case a few years ago when I was writing about it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so they have this small creamery, and so they sell heavy cream and milk and 2% milk, and they had been dumping their skim milk and using it as feed, I think, for their pigs. But some of their customers asked, "Hey, I'd love to buy skim milk from you." And so they said, "Oh, great!" So they started marketing it, and this creamery, it's pasteurized milk, so it's not a raw milk question. They were selling their cream and their milk and whatnot in the area, and everything was fine. They had state inspectors visited and always found that they were following proper procedures, never dinged them for any regulatory errors or anything like that, to the best of my knowledge at least. And then one day, I think it was a new inspector even, showed up at the facility and was kind of looking through their operation and said, "Yeah, what do you got here?" And they said, "Oh, it's skim milk." And the inspector, kind of, their eyes got really big, and they said, "Well, do you add vitamin A to your skim milk?" And they said, "Well, no, we don't add anything to our milk because we're an all natural creamery and we pride ourselves on delivering an all natural product." And the inspector said, "Well, the regulations say that you have to add vitamin A to your skim milk, and if you're going to call it skim milk." And they said, "Well, that doesn't make any sense. Our customers won't buy it if we have these additives in it." And they said, "Well, what can we do?" And the state said, "Well, how about this? How about instead of calling it skim milk, you call it," and here's a quote, "non-grade A milk product, natural milk vitamins removed," end quote.
But it's not
And
removed if it was never there, right?
that's, well, yes and no. Vitamin A binds to fat, and so when you remove the fat, you remove also the vitamin A, which is
Okay.
the basis, the argument for adding that vitamin to skim milk. And at one point in America, there were vitamin A deficiencies, but that doesn't really exist anymore. And so, I'm sure some individuals have it, but it's very, very rare to find vitamin A deficiencies in people. And also, when you're when you're consuming vitamin A, you need to have it with fat in order to have the vitamin actually kind of benefit your system. Otherwise, it just goes right through you. Well, skim milk obviously has no fat, so the point of adding vitamin A to skim milk is completely lost unless you're having you're drinking a glass of cream with your glass of skim milk. And so O'Cheesy Creamery sued, said, "Listen, we have a right to call our skim milk. There's nothing in our skim milk except skim milk, and we're not going to call our product non-grade A milk, whatever, non-grade A milk natural milk vitamins removed, I think. And the state said, all right, well, how about this? How about you just call it imitation skim milk? And they just kind of threw up their hands and said, listen, it's not imitation skim milk, it's just skim milk. And so they sued and they actually won on First Amendment grounds. The premise being uh, that they should be able to call their product by its actual name, which was very clear. So again, there's a federal lawsuit going on right now around that case, or around a separate case with the FDA, which governs all, regulates all milk and interstate commerce. And so Ocheesy can't sell its products across state lines, for example, with this non-grade A milk product or without that label, because the FDA says, listen, you can't, you must add vitamin A to skim milk if it's going across state lines. I'm oversimplifying, but that's the basic premise. I worked on this case a bit, the Ocheesy case, and I was very happy that Ocheesy was able to win that case. But it's just such a ridiculous example. And of course, the one of the big lobby groups for the big dairy producers, which I think it was the National Milk Producers Federation, but I apologize if I got the name of the lobby wrong. It's one of the two biggest dairy lobbies in the country. They actually submitted an opinion, an amicus brief, as it's known, in the Florida case, arguing that Ocheesy shouldn't be able to call their skim milk, because they are the sort of big government and big business in cahoots with each other. They want vitamin A added to all milk in this country, and they're not going to step aside and let some upstart little creamery be competing with them. So, I mean, that's about as clear an example as one can have of regulations that don't benefit any producers, particularly the smaller ones, except the huge giant ones who want to sort of squash competition. And lawmakers and regulators are really, they see a big company talking about something and think that automatically whatever that big company is saying is the truth, and oftentimes it's not.
That's a crazy example. I'm glad they won that case. That's a win at least. I
Yeah,
mean, the
yeah,
fact that they had to
sure.
deal with that at all kind of is eh, not
Yeah,
great, but you know, at least we won type of thing. So, food trucks.
yeah.
About 10 years ago, there was this war on food trucks, and you were pretty active and very active in fighting the bans that threatened the new industry of food trucks. So, can you talk to us about who tried at least to ban food trucks and why? And where do food trucks stand? Like, what sorts of regulations are in place?
So the food trucks, they've become increasingly common. Back when I was a kid, most food trucks were known as quote roach coach, just as these sort of cockroach carrying vehicles that drove around aimlessly and served slop. But there were always good food trucks, and not to diminish or demean the slop. If people are buying, then you should be selling. Um, but there are also, particularly in Los Angeles County and other parts of California, have always been these strong sort of immigrant food trucks, particularly Mexican. But throughout the country, you'll find almost any job site where there are workers. You'll find a really good food truck servicing that spot. Um, so many cities around the country have these rules in place. And of course, some cities have banned them and I think still ban them. But the premise is that there are various types of regulations. You can regulate the place that a food truck may serve, or the time or the amount of time that they can stop at a particular place. You can regulate what they can sell. So there are all sorts of regulations around food trucks, and some cities have done pretty well, and other cities have done terrible jobs. And I think of Chicago is one particularly bad example where they have these proximity restrictions, and goes back to your sort of question, the last question about big business. So you've got restaurant associations, which are very, very powerful. And in many cities, not all, but in many cities, they've fought against the presence of food trucks, particularly if they're within some radius of a restaurant. And Chicago has rules in place. I think it's like 200 feet. You can't sell food within 200 feet of a brick and mortar restaurant, although I think they've added a few sort of designated spots downtown. But the premise is, and almost every lawmaker who, and it's usually city councils that are passing these rules, they'll say, "Oh, we're doing this to protect the restaurant industry." And it's like, where's the restaurant industry when, a Chinese restaurant wants to open up next to a pizzeria, or another pizzeria wants to open up next to a pizzeria? Why aren't we protecting existing restaurants from competition by other restaurants? And the answer is because it's un-American and it's stupid, and no one has a right to tell you where you can open up a business. And if food trucks rarely park in front of existing restaurants because that just means more competition. But should they be free to, as long as it's a legal parking spot? Sure, absolutely. And you find food trucks at a lot of breweries, for example, have this kind of symbiotic relationship where you've got this food truck. Maybe the brewery doesn't want to sell food, and the food truck isn't allowed to sell beer. So you've got this, food truck parks at a brewery, and then everyone's happy. Consumers, food truck owner, brewery owner, everyone's better off. No one's worse off, and that's the goal, I think, of all laws is and should be that. And restaurants, brick and mortar ones, and again, I don't mean to paint too broad a brush. There are plenty of people who own brick and mortar restaurants and food trucks, or people who own brick and mortar restaurants who embrace food trucks as peers and as competitors. But the idea that these restaurants, the brick and mortar ones, need some sort of laws passed to help them get by, or that they even have a right to ask for that, is ridiculous. And thankfully, a lot of those laws have kind of gone by the wayside. But as I said, Chicago and elsewhere, we still have those rules in place.
So, finally, what is one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
This was another really good question and really difficult, that I probably thought about for far too long. But here's what I got. So I used to try to avoid talking with people who I knew I disagreed with on various issues, because that's a lot more tense than it is just talking with people you agree with. Um, and but once if you find people who you disagree with but who you can have good conversations with, it ends up being far more interesting than simply talking to people you agree with. You learn something, you learn more about, we all basically, what we're looking at is, there's a finite number of facts in the world. Water is wet. Um, a foot is 12 inches in length. These are things about which we, I suppose someone, a particle physicist or something, might disagree with something I just said. But for the most part, these are the rules, the norms that govern us. And so it's interesting to speak with people who, they acknowledge the same facts that you and I do, but then they analyze them in a different way, and they come to different conclusions. And this is true of, not just kind of food law, but just of the world, of, religion, of all the kind of big questions. And if we shut ourselves off from those people, then we've really, we've done ourselves and them a disservice. So those are the people I most enjoy speaking with now, and has been the case for some time, that I feel like I can learn, and I think others can learn from me too, and we can find common ground. I guess in the end, it's much more important in life, I think, to find people who like you, and vice versa, than it is to find people who think like you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you so much. Thank you for this entire interview. I had a really good time. I mean, this is a lot to cover. It's a broad topic, and there's still so much more to talk about. I would recommend all my listeners go read Baylen's book and follow what he does to learn more about silly rules that get in the way of us eating food and just everything food related in general. Like, drinking raw milk or even just skim milk. Um, Thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks, Juliet. It was great to chat with you, and I really appreciate your having me on and asking some really great questions.